I see we've got lots of people signing on, and we'll just give people another minute or two for the system to catch up, and then we will get started with today's webinar. For those who are just joining us, we're just going to take another minute or so and let people call in, and then we will get started. Okay, I think we've got a great crowd here, so let's go ahead. So hi, everybody. Welcome back to the next talk in the Division 34 2020 webinar series. I'm really glad to see so many people signed in. We've got a great talk lined up today, and it's really nice to see so many people signed in, and lots of new people this time as well. So just a couple quick notes. There is a Q&A open, so for anybody who's got any questions as our speaker is going along, please enter them there. And after she's gotten through some of her prepared remarks, then we'll do some Q&A back and forth. So today I am extremely excited to introduce and hear from our 7th speaker in the 2020 webinar series, Sarah Mancoll. Sarah is the policy director for the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, and will be speaking with us today about how we can translate psychological science into effective policy advocacy. And it's really our pleasure to have her here today. So Sarah, thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you for now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you foremost to Division 34. I think this is a very exciting topic for a webinar series. I always am really thrilled when psychologists are interested in doing policy work and learning more about how to effectively do policy work. And so I'd really like to thank Dr. Ezra Markowitz, your president, for inviting me to speak today, and to Division 34. I know that Division 34 and SPICY, my organization, have a number of members who are members of both. So it's always a great opportunity for me to kind of help build bridges between the different social justice-minded divisions, and I'm excited to be doing that today. So a little bit about me and my organization. As some of you may know, SPICY is the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. We're Division 9 of the American Psychological Association. And we were founded in the 1930s. And really one of our foundational beliefs is that research that produces nothing but books will not suffice. We've always been very committed to both basic and applied science, but really moreover, to using science to inform policy. And I put a few examples of that work on the screen here. You can see we had a recent issue of the Journal of Social Issues, one of our peer-reviewed journals, that focused on the social psychological contributions to sustainable consumption. That came out just a month or two ago, really. Right below that, on the left-hand side, we have a picture from a congressional briefing that we hosted a few years back with Dr. Susan Clayton, who was a SPICY president. She was also a Division 34 president a number of years ago. And she did a congressional briefing for staffers on the Hill talking about resilience toward the effects of climate change. We also put together a report and brief several years ago on building resilient communities in the face of climate change. And I also have there on the far right side an op-ed that Dr. Clayton wrote during her presidency at SPICY about the Paris Climate Change Agreement and kind of what it means from a psychologist perspective and where we go from there. So this gives you just a little sense of how we've been involved in policy around climate change, climate justice. And what I'd really like to do today is to talk about how you as a psychologist or as a psychology student can get more involved in the policy landscape and bring your expertise and your knowledge and your understanding and your tools really to the policy making world and different ways that you can do that as a psychologist. So first, I like to start with a little primer on using research to inform policy. These are just two papers that I've pulled. There's a whole body of research on how policymakers use research, and it's a really interesting and kind of new and burgeoning body of research. The first paper I've cited here is from Choi and colleagues, and it's a paper from the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health called "Can Scientists and Policymakers Work Together?" And I think the paper puts a very positive spin on it, but the authors kind of go through all of the barriers that arise when you try to put policymakers and scientists in a room together to talk to one another. Policymakers and scientists have different goals. They speak different languages. They operate at different time scales. They think about quote unquote evidence in different ways. They also have different attention spans. They have very different priorities, and they have different people to whom they're accountable. So when we're thinking about using our science to inform policy, we have to keep in mind that policymakers have very different motivations and are coming from very different places than scientists, and we have to kind of rise to meet them where they are in a lot of ways. There's also a very good paper by Vivian Sang from 2012. It was a social policy report published by the Society for Research in Child Development. And she talked about how research is actually used in policy and practice. She focused especially on educational research and educational policymaking, but it could really apply to many different contexts. Foremost, I think one of the really interesting things she talked about were the role of trusted intermediaries. In the policy world, scientists don't generally just go out and meet policymakers and say, hey, I have some research to tell you about, and I think you would find it interesting. We rely a lot on intermediaries. These are knowledge brokers, relationship brokers, organizations that kind of grease the wheels and help to make sure that policymakers hear scientists, and scientists also hear policymakers. And I'm going to go on my next slide into a little bit what intermediaries look like, because they're very diverse and they come from a lot of different sectors. The second thing I want to pull out of the Tseng paper is the concept of policy windows. And I always like to use the example of high quality early child care and education because I worked on that for many years and I know it somewhat well. But the idea is that in the policy world, sometimes policymakers aren't ready to hear your science or they're not ready to act on it. And so what you have to do as a scientist is kind of seed all of that information. You have to bring it to the policy space and you have to keep planting seeds. And then someday, because of a changing cultural environment, because of something new and unexpected like COVID-19, that arises, a window opens up, an opportunity opens up to push a policy through. And that happened very much in the early child care and education world. For years and years and years, there was some really great research being done on how important high quality early child care and education was. There was the Abecedarian Project, Perry Preschool. These were research studies, demonstration projects done back in the 1960s, 1970s. Then we had public pre-K, which came along in Tulsa and Boston. And we had this body of research evidence that grew and grew and grew. And then because the political climate shifted, in 2015, under Congress and with a White House that was amenable to the idea, we were able to push through the Preschool Development Grant Birth Through 5 program, which is part of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, ESEA, reauthorization. And that gave about $250 million in funding for states to improve their early child care systems. So I like to say, even though there may not be a policy window yet, it's important for researchers to be at the table because you're planting seeds, and hopefully at some point in the future, you'll be able to kind of harvest those plants, but maybe not quite yet. Going back to the point I made earlier, it's really important to know who your intermediaries are. These are the organizations that are going to help connect you to policymakers. So these can be your department, your college, your university press office, your public affairs office. I know when I was an undergraduate at a land-grant university, they organized a trip for a bunch of us undergraduates who were on federal financial aid to go to the State House and to talk about the importance for financial aid for students whose families can't afford college outright. So look at your university, look at your School of Arts and Sciences or your School of Public Health or wherever you sit within your university. See who those entities are that are working with and have connections to the policy world. I think working with coalitions is also very important. There are all sorts of coalitions at the international, national, local levels. In DC, I work with the Climate Science Working Group, which is a coalition of scientific associations that are working to bring climate science to policymakers on the Hill primarily. And I'm actually the only social science person there. All of the other scientific associations there are, you know, meteorology and atmospheric sciences. And one thing I found is that it's really helpful for psychologists and social scientists to be in the room because so much of the kind of discussions we're having about climate change in Washington are being driven by the non-social sciences, which is great, but I think it also really adds to the story that they tell and adds to the importance of the issue when you have psychologists and social scientists in the room, especially those who can help tell that climate justice piece, which I think is oftentimes missing from those discussions. There are also groups like the International Climate and Clean Air Coalition. In my home state of Maryland, there's the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. So look around and see what informal coalitions, informal or formal coalitions, are working on climate issues and how you can get involved because they often have their ear to the ground, and through them you'll know what's going on. Also, intermediaries can be scientific societies, professional societies, industry societies. So here are going to be your AAASs, your APAs, your Division 34s, your SPICEs. I would also look to funders. A lot of funders, including federal agencies like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, but also private foundations are very involved in science policy. And you can really leverage your relationships with your funders to help make sure that your voice is at the table. I would also look to advocacy groups. While some advocacy groups do conduct their own research, many advocacy groups use research to inform their own advocacy work. You see this with groups like Eco America, the U.S. Climate Action Network. So definitely don't be shy about getting to know which advocacy groups are working in your area of interest and seeing if they could use an expert in their periphery to help weigh in, to help shape the kind of talking points that are coming out of that network. And then finally, also news media. You have the New York Times and the Washington Post and the NPR, but you also have online news media like Slate and Vox. You have Medium, you have The Conversation. I even listened to a great podcast a few weeks ago called Two Psychologists, Four Beers, which is a podcast where two psychologists invite a fellow psychologist to have some beers and discuss their research over a podcast, and it's brilliant. So really think very broadly when you're thinking about news media. These are all different groups that can be trusted intermediaries that can help connect you to policymakers and vice versa. And the final note here is don't be afraid to reach out and alert them to your work when it's on an issue that you think may be of interest to them, because generally policymakers and intermediary organizations won't necessarily seek you out. You have to, do the job of putting yourself in their periphery. The next point I wanted to make, and this is kind of an overarching point, and then I can go into examples of each of these bullets, is that policy happens at different levels of governance. So at the international level, we have the United Nations and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We have the Paris Climate Change Agreement. At the national level, we have a whole slew of activity. We have federal legislation. We have federal regulations. We also have federal court decisions. At the state level, I'm going to go into two examples in this talk. One, we have state-level climate action plans and state attorney generals who are currently suing the oil industry in primarily state courts. At the local level, we have so many different examples I could pull from. I pulled two examples here. One is partnering with local communities to document and advocate against disparities, and the other is documenting and addressing the disproportionate location of landfills, incinerators, garbage dumps, and garbage transfer stations in Black neighborhoods. And then finally, institutional policy is also important. And here I am going to talk about SPICY's decision to divest from fossil fuels under the leadership of Dr. Susan Clayton, who was our president at that time, and Dr. Richard Weiner, who was and currently is our secretary treasurer. So these are all different levels at which you can work on policy. And so when you're thinking about policy work, people are often drawn to what's happening at the federal level. And while what's happening at the federal level is incredibly important, it's also important to be attuned to what's happening at the international level, at the state level, at the local level, and your skills and interests may plug into those areas in different ways. So for my first example, I wanted to talk about international policy. So here you have a few pictures of SPICY's UN team. We've actually had consultative status at the United Nations since the 1990s, and we have a small team of representatives and interns who meet at the UN once a week. They put on side events, also known as briefings, and they also help plan the annual Psychology Day at the UN. And in fact, a few years ago, the theme of Psychology Day was climate change and climate action. So here you have a few pictures of our SPICY team. They gave a presentation recently at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, Science and Human Rights Coalition meeting, which is a mouthful. And they talked a lot about sustainability. And actually, in the center of this slide, you can see a letter that SPICY endorsed. Our UN team actually brought it to our attention. This is a letter that was signed by, I think, well over 100, actually, NGOs that have consultative status at the UN. And they specifically talked about how the UN needs to pay attention to sustainability as it helps build back after COVID-19. I think there's a real fear within the NGO community that a lot of the momentum on sustainability will have been lost and that COVID-19 will have derailed us a bit. And so the letter goes into specific recommendations that the NGO community has for the UN, and you can find that full letter on SPICY's website. I try to post everything we sign on to on our website so that people can access it if they're interested. But this is one example of some of the policy work that we've been doing at the international level, which we especially like to do through our UN committee, and they're a very active committee. So it's a great example of some of the work that psychologists are doing in this area. Another example of international policy work is the HBCU Climate Consortium delegation at the Paris climate change talks. So I learned about this work from Dr. Robert Ballard. He was a guest presenter at the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition meeting a few years ago. And he's kind of known in the sociology world as the father of environmental justice. And in 2011, because of the urgent need to diversify leadership in the environmental arena, Dr. Beverly Wright of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and Dr. Robert Ballard of Texas Southern University launched the Historically Black College and University Climate Change Consortium. And the consortium actually brought a delegation of 51 students and faculty members to the climate change talks in Paris several years ago. And one thing that really came across in Dr. Ballard's presentation at AAAS, he said the most vulnerable in our society are the hardest hit and have contributed the least to climate change. And his mission as a sociologist, as a social scientist, is to make sure that the kinds of people who have historically been left out of climate change policy are there at the table when policy is being made. This is especially true for students at HBCUs because in the US, climate change has disproportionately harmed people of color, people in the Southeast. And so he felt that it was especially important for HBCUs to be represented and for HBCUs to play this important role in bringing Black students and scholars to the Paris climate talks to make sure that they're part of the process and that they're part of kind of the vision we have going forward. The next example I wanted to go into, now we're moving from international down to national policy, is the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. You can see a picture of their report on the right-hand side. The Select Committee was authorized by House Resolution 6 in January of 2019, and it was charged with delivering ambitious climate policy recommendations to Congress in order to achieve substantial and permanent reductions in pollution and other activities that contribute to climate crisis. And the report was actually just released a few weeks ago on June 30th. The Climate Crisis Action Plan calls for reaching 100% clean net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050, establishing ambitious interim targets to assess progress and reduce pollution in environmental justice communities, and achieving net negative emissions during the second half of the century. And the plan was also widely endorsed by more than 90 major outside organizations. Now, this was a project of the House Democrats. They did not include any Republicans in the activity, and it's yet to be seen how much House or more broadly Senate Republicans will latch on to at least some of the ideas in the report. Certainly, probably nothing will happen before the election, but it does seem to be, in many respects, a very ambitious report, and it's something pretty big that came out of the House recently. But of course, I don't think it's been in the news a whole lot because there's been a lot of other things going on. But that is a big thing happening at the national level right now. And then moving down one level to state policy, I was thinking about how so many of the different states have reacted so differently to COVID-19. And it got me thinking about climate action plans. And I was curious, so I did a little Googling. And interestingly, according to the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, as of June 2020, only 32 states in the country have released a climate action plan or are in the process of revising or developing one. And you can't even really see it there because it's kind of hidden by the key, but the state of Alaska actually had a plan and then rescinded it. So as you can see across the country, there's a lot of variation state by state in terms of how states are even planning on dealing with the effects of climate change. And so arguably, there are a lot of opportunities at the state level to get involved. This map just gives you one sense of how varied things can be from state to state and that they're constantly in flux. I mean, this is a map that's current as of June 2020, but there's been a lot of movement on this map over the last few years and likely will continue to be over the next few years. On my next slide, I wanted to give a shout out to a local project from a SPICY member who actually has a conflicting call right now, so she wasn't able to be on this call, but she's here in spirit. So to give you an example of local policy work, I have a project involving researchers at the University of Maine who worked with the Katahdin region of Maine to assess economic and community resilience. And this is kind of a cool story because it came out of an op-ed of all things. In March of 2016, SPICY Policy Committee co-chair Dr. Linda Silka published an op-ed in the Bangor Daily News. And in this piece, she wrote about how University of Maine faculty and students were eager to work with communities in tackling complex or quote unquote wicked problems at the intersection of economic, sociocultural, and environmental issues. And after this op-ed came out, a community leader in this region of Maine actually reached out to Dr. Silka and said, hey, we could really use your help. So that established a now long-running collaboration between researchers at the University of Maine and this community. They have partnered to conduct a quantitative assessment of the region, looking at indicators such as the unemployment rate, household income, population size, age of residence, in order to understand past and current conditions and make informed decisions about how to strengthen the region's future. This is a big former logging area where they had a lot of paper mills, and the area had really gone into decline over the last generation or so. And they're looking to revitalize their community, but they want to do so in a way that, you know, looks forward and doesn't look behind. In addition, the survey of the region's residents, a survey of the region's residents is underway. And the purpose of this survey is to understand how residents view community and economic well-being in the region and to help gather ideas about how the area can grow socially and economically. I have one more example of local policy work. Here, I'm going back to the work of sociologist Dr. Robert Bullard and environmental justice, specifically in Houston, where he's based. So Dr. Bullard is at Texas Southern University. He began there in 1978. And in Houston, he noted in the late 1970s, it was about 52% white, 27% black, 18% Hispanic, and about 3% Asian or other. And the government at that time, however, was pretty much all white and all male. And so the lack of equitable representation had consequences. In place of NIMBY, not in my backyard politics, Houston practiced a PIBY, place in blacks backyard policy. So government and private industry targeted Houston's black neighborhoods for landfills, incinerators, garbage dumps, and garbage transfer stations. And so right around the time that Dr. Bullard arrived, there was a proposal to build the Whispering Pines Sanitary Landfill near Northwood Manor, which was a mostly black middle-class neighborhood. And so as a young sociologist, he was asked to conduct a study of solid waste disposal siting in Houston for a class action lawsuit that had been filed against the city and the state and the local industry. And although the case was lost, it marked an important beginning as the first lawsuit in the U.S. that charged environmental discrimination in solid waste facility siting under the Civil Rights Act. And here I have a picture that Dr. Bullard actually took of residents in Northwood Manor protesting the landfill in 1979. So here I'm just trying to give you a few examples of the many different ways that researchers have been involved in policy at the international, national, state, local levels, and the many different ways you can kind of imagine becoming involved. And there are many, many different entry points. Going now down a level to institutional level policy, I wanted to talk about SPICY's own policy. So a number of years ago, Dr. Susan Clayton was president of SPICY, and she really wanted SPICY to look inward and to make sure that all of our policies as an organization lined up with our values. And so our secretary treasurer, Dr. Richard Weiner, looked at our investments and noticed that we had a number of investments in fossil fuels. And this wasn't really, it wasn't something we had actively ever really thought about. We had an investment company that made investments for us, and we hadn't really noticed it before. But, thinking about our values and thinking about, the values that we were rooted in and where we wanted to go, he brought this to our council and said, you know, I really don't think we should have investments in fossil fuels. This isn't spiffy. This isn't who we are. And so our council voted to divest of fossil fuels. And over that year, we directed our investment advisor to take all of those investments out of fossil fuels and redistribute them elsewhere, including in renewables. And there's a whole movement. And so I know that this has been a big topic of discussion at a lot of universities. Many universities have divested of fossil fuels, but not all. And there are many universities, in fact, that are still very much invested in fossil fuels. So this is one example of working on climate policy, but at a very, very local level within your own institution or within institutions that you have connections to, whether they're your professional associations or your universities or other organizations that you have a connection to. For the next little bit of my talk, I want to give an overview on how policy can happen within different branches of government and how you as a researcher can get involved in policy at the legislative level, at the executive level, at the judicial level. And again, this also happens within the national kind of context, within the state context, within the local context. So here I'm going to be talking primarily at the national context, but you can also think of it in other contexts as well. So for the legislative piece, I want to talk about the Congressional Climate Caucus. For the executive branch piece, I'd like to talk about recent executive orders and requests for comment regarding proposed revisions to federal regulations. And for the judicial piece, I want to talk about major cases working their way through state and federal courts. So on the legislative end, we have some newer caucuses called the Climate Solutions Caucus. The Senate caucus is actually very new. It's not even a year old. So several years ago, members in the House, one Democrat and one Republican, founded the Climate Solutions Caucus. And the rule was that people had to enter the caucus on a 1-to-1 ratio of Democrats to Republicans. So if you had 4 Democrats in the caucus, you had to have 4 Republicans in the caucus. And it was really, I think, a very clever way of making sure that they could build buy-in among Republicans, because there were some Republicans who were interested in climate change, but it was, you know, it's very hard to get people on board when it's a whole sea of Democrats signing up for something and you don't really have a Republican even listed as a co-sponsor. So currently the House Climate Solutions Caucus is chaired by Ted Deutsch from Florida and Francis Rooney, also from Florida. It was formed in 2016, and because there have been a few elections since then and some attrition, it's actually a bit lopsided now. So there are many more Democrats on the caucus now than there are Republicans, but it did start out at a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus was formed by Senator Michael Braun of Indiana and Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. And in keeping with the tradition set by the House, it also has a 1-to-1 ratio of Republicans to Democrats. Since its inception in late 2019, the caucus has held a number of meetings, including a June 2020 meeting with former military and defense officials to discuss the linkages between climate and national security. And I should mention that caucuses are great for building interest, for showing solidarity, for raising awareness. They don't necessarily introduce legislation. They're really not there to tell people how to vote necessarily, but they're really there to kind of help raise awareness about an issue. And so these caucuses are still kind of in their infancy, and climate change up until recently wasn't even something that most, if any, Republicans would even talk about. So it is kind of it feels to me like a watershed moment that there are these caucuses and that they have both Republicans and Democrats on them, and that they are hosting hearings and gathering information. If anything comes of them, I don't know. I don't know that anything will. But with the Climate Science Working Group that I'm a part of, every year we do visits with House and Senate members of the climate caucuses, and we also meet with the offices of Republicans and Democrats who are not yet members to try to encourage them to join the caucuses. So this is one way that climate issues are being addressed on the legislative end. It hasn't necessarily led to any legislation yet, but it's at least raising awareness and creating space for climate issues to be talked about in Congress, which is a step. The next area of policy I wanted to talk about is within the executive branch. I have two examples here. One is EPA's quote-unquote censored science rule. This is very recent. I tried to take some examples that are kind of hot off the press. Basically, the Environmental Protection Agency back in 2018 proposed a rule that its guidelines going forward would not take into account science for which the data and models are not publicly available. Obviously, this creates all sorts of problems because a lot of epidemiological science that environmental regulations are based on, that data is not publicly available, and for good reason, because you can't publicly share people's medical data. It's unethical. And a lot of people in the science community felt that the EPA was putting this rule forward because basically it doesn't want to take into account science that it finds inconvenient. So there were a number of great open letters, editorials in all sorts of science and non-science news outlets talking about how problematic this proposed rule was. The rule has been amended and reproposed, but this happened back in March when COVID-19 was kind of raging, and there was a lot of talk in the science community about how people felt that the EPA was trying to kind of slip one past them. This is not done. The comments period has closed. Likely a final rule will come out before the elections. Of course, if the executive branch changes hands with the elections, then none of this will matter. But it is really important, and it's something to keep on people's horizons, and it likely won't be going away. It's not just the EPA. There are other executive branch agencies that have proposed similar rules. And unfortunately, this is one of those things that has really alarmed the science community over the last year or so. Another example I wanted to give, this is an example of the APA issuing an open letter to President Obama several years ago to thank the White House for postponing the oil pipeline through Standing Rock Reservation. So in 2016, APA issued an open letter to President Obama thanking him for that decision and saying, quote, "As psychologists, we are particularly troubled by the potential for adverse neurological effects of oil-contaminated water. Moreover, we are disturbed that the pipeline was considered too risky to route through Bismarck, North Dakota, but not to the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation." The letter, you can find it online. It also talks a lot about historical trauma, about the particular traumas faced by Native American communities. And so this is one more example of how psychologists can have a voice in policymaking. In this case, it was to say thank you to the White House. And I think saying thank you is really important. Oftentimes, researchers like to write letters asking for changes, X, Y, and Z we don't like, change this, change that. It's also really important for us as psychologists to say thank you when policymakers do things that we like and that we approve of, because they like to hear that. And it also, it helps them with making their case to sometimes very difficult audiences. Another example I wanted to give, now this is at the judicial level. This is state attorney generals suing the oil industry in mostly state but also federal courts. So if you have seen the news lately, there's a lot in the news. But one news item is that the Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison announced that Minnesota would be suing ExxonMobil, Koch Industries, and the American Petroleum Institute over what he calls, quote, a campaign of deception about climate change that the companies orchestrated and executed with disturbing success. This actually builds on a number of other lawsuits. Rhode Island, New York, Massachusetts, and others have sued the oil industry with varying degrees of success. And cities and counties are also getting involved in this. San Francisco, Oakland, Baltimore, San Miguel and Boulder counties in Colorado. For each lawsuit, the defendants and charges are different. Many of these cases are percolating in state courts, but they may jump to federal courts at some point in the future. After an appeals court in March allowed Baltimore to pursue its climate claims in Maryland state court, energy industry lawyers asked the nation's highest court to intervene. That petition is still pending. But here again, psychologists can get involved. I'm not aware of too many, if any, amicus briefs focused on psychology and climate change, but that would be really awesome if one were to come out at some point. I know that the APA has been very active in submitting amicus briefs to the federal courts on issues around affirmative action, issues around discrimination in healthcare settings. I don't believe that I've seen any related to climate issues, but that's not to say that we can't in the future see some related to climate issues. For the final piece of my presentation, I just want to touch on strategies for communicating for policy. This is a talk I've given a few times before, but it's always a useful one. When you're communicating for policy, I think it's really helpful to have a few things in mind. One, have a clear message. Two, know your audience. Who is your audience? And three, understand what media are best for communicating with that particular audience. So for the first part of this, what's your message? Your message could be that psychology needs a seat at the table when we talk about climate change and climate justice. Your message could be our state needs a climate action plan. Your message could be historically marginalized populations in our city deserve to breathe clean air too. Figure out what your message is. It could be based on your particular area of expertise, or it could be of broader interest to you and you're just a psychologist who happens to have a lot of skills and tools at his disposal that you can bring to the issue. Once you figure out what your message is, you're going to want to identify your audience. So is your audience your city's mayor or council? Is it state legislators? Is it federal executive branch policymakers? Is it Congress? Is it federal judges? Is it parents, healthcare providers, other scientists, fellow psychologists, business leaders, the public? I have a fun headline here from an op-ed, or not an op-ed, it was a general kind of news story. How to explain the climate crisis to your boomer this Christmas. And it was a headline from an article that appeared in Wired UK, and the article quoted several social scientists, including former SPICY President Susan Clayton and former SPICY Policy Committee member Sandra van der Linden, and it's just a really fun article. But clearly the audience here is kind of the public, right? You know, how do you as a regular person going home for Christmas talk about climate change with your parents or with your aunt and uncle or with your siblings? So identify your audience. And then finally, figure out what medium can best help you reach that target audience with your message. So do you want to write a brief or a fact sheet, a white paper? Do you want to write a public comment to a federal request for comment? What about putting together an amicus brief related to a pending court case? What about practice guides, perhaps for healthcare practitioners? What about open letters or op-eds, blogging, tweeting? There's so many ways that you can communicate with policymakers, and it really just depends on who your target audience is and what your message is. And here I have a clip from Dr. Aparna Bull from the American Academy of Pediatrics. She testified before the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis back in February, and that's just one way. She gave testimony before Congress people, but there are many, many ways to communicate science for policymakers. It just depends on who you're talking to and what you have to say that will determine what the best medium is for reaching that particular audience. And finally, some entry points for doing policy work. One is connect with your policymakers. Policymakers can't rely on your expertise or knowledge if they don't know who you are. You can call the offices of your local, state, or federal policymakers and make an appointment to meet with them in person or virtually, and then stay in touch with them. Keep them apprised of what you're doing or things that come up that you think might be of interest to them. And if you want some hands-on experience, APA runs a number of advocacy days. SPICY has also started to run advocacy days. And so stay tuned to your various professional associations because there might be a good opportunity to get some hands-on training in how to do a meeting with a policymaker. And then once you do one, you can do a million more. You kind of know the nuts and bolts of how to do it. Another opportunity is to learn new skills in research translation. So here there's the Scholars Strategy Network, the Op-Ed Project. These are both great nonprofits that provide training in op-ed writing. I also have here seek out opportunities to serve the public in an official capacity. So there are a number of federal advisory bodies that are always looking for nominees. These are usually listed in the Federal Register, and you'll also find out about them through your professional societies. I try to list them once a month in the policy update that I send to SPICY members, and I know APA also shares these in their communications. And then I also have here conduct policy relevant research if you aren't already. SPICY, for example, offers a number of grants that are specific to policy work, including our local and state level policy work awards. They're $2,000 awards, which you can use as seed money to kick off a project or as money to do a new kind of leg of a project. But they're specifically for people who are doing research that's relevant to local or state level policy issues. And then finally, think about becoming a policy fellow at the federal or state level. AAAS, APA, SPICY, and many other organizations sponsor policy fellowships in the congressional branch, in the executive branch. There are also a number of states now that have science policy fellowships, including California and Missouri. SRCD, the Society for Research and Child Development, sponsors state-level policy fellowships. I will add the links for these and send them to Ezra, and he can share them around. But seriously, consider it as a career stepping stone if you're more of an early career person or you're just finishing up grad school, or consider it a sabbatical, a really cool sabbatical if you're more mid or senior career and you're just looking to do something a little different for a year. And finally, thank you so much, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Tons of really interesting and useful info for people, both content specific in the climate domain, but also I think some really critical pointers for people more broadly who are interested in jumping into doing some translation and advocacy work. So we do have a few questions and we've got about 10 minutes. And if other questions pop up, I hope folks will enter them into the Q&A. So first we'll start with a question. Could you elaborate a bit on how to incorporate the subject matter of psychology in particular into policy and the kinds of theories or topics which could contribute to policymaking? And I think on a related note, if you could speak a little bit on how to justify the need for psychological researchers to get a seat at the table. And I think that is a really critical question because you know, some domains and topics, it makes clear sense. We're talking about early childhood development. Obviously, we need to have psychologists at the table. I think for many policymakers, it can be a little bit less obvious in the environmental domain when we're thinking about, especially big global issue like climate change. Why should psychologists be at the table? So how do we do that? How do we get people to think that we should be there at the table, and what should we bring to that table?
I think it can be a challenging question, but I think COVID-19 has provided the best excuse ever for why psychologists need to be at the table. I mean, I actually was just watching an interview this morning that Dr. Sander van der Linden gave on, I forget which, I think it was BBC News he was giving about mask wearing and how to get people to wear their masks. And so much, all of the major problems that our society is facing, climate change being, you know, the big one, are all social problems. They're people problems. And I think COVID-19 especially has kind of unwrapped the packaging and shown just how important psychology and the other social sciences are. But we have to beat that drum, and we have to insert ourselves into that discussion, and we have to make sure that policymakers know that we are willing and able to be at that table. And so I think there's an openness in the science community to having psychologists at the table. And I just watched a hearing I think it was last week. There was a hearing in the House on science funding. And the president, the CEO of American Association for the Advancement of Sciences was talking. And he was talking about social sciences. I mean, you know, you have the CEO of AAAS who's talking about how important the social sciences are and why the social sciences are critical for national science funding. And I think we've already made the case, but now we need to keep kind of feeding the fire and making sure that we're there and we're engaged. But I think the other sciences and policymakers do appreciate what we bring to the table. I don't think it's like 10 or 20 years ago where people were like, why is there a psychologist here?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I do think we've seen a rapid shift over the last decade or so on various fronts, particularly in the environmental domain, with respect to including psychologists and social scientists more broadly, and a recognition that we all have a critical perspective to contribute if we're going to really deal with the problems that are in front of us. So actually related to that, we have a question just wondering if you have any insight in particular into the climate action plans that you were referencing at the state level, where there might be a particular role for psychological science and input to be emphasized, or have you seen anywhere in those climate action plans? I mean, I know you're a generalist and you work on lots and lots of topics, so you may or may not have an answer to this, but if you have seen anywhere where there's been psychological input into the development or implementation of climate action plans?
I know a really good person to ask would be Dr. Linda Silka, because I know that she's actually very involved in state level policy on climate change in Maine. My sense of state level policy, just from working in Washington and then kind of getting a sense of how it's done in Maryland at the state level, is that state level policy making doesn't have the same breadth of resources and expertise that Congress has on hand. I mean, in each congressional office, you have, you know, in a House office, you might have 13 or 14 staff members supporting a member of Congress. In a Senate office, they have dozens of staff members. So they have whole staff members who are just dedicated to their education portfolio or their infrastructure portfolio. At the state level, you don't really have that. You have state legislatures that are usually in session for part of the year. Each lawmaker may or may not have one professional staff member who is expected to work on every issue, from environment to tax policy to like health to everything. So I think there's a real need at the state level in general for the kind of expertise that psychologists can bring to the table. And there is not the same degree of resources, human capital resources and financial resources at the state level. So they're desperate for it. I mean, I don't work at the state level as closely as I work at the federal level. So I'm not the expert in this area, but my sense is that they're desperate for this expertise that they really don't have in-house in the same way that the federal government has in-house.
Yeah, I want to reemphasize that point. I've had some opportunities to interact with both local municipality leaders in Western Massachusetts, you know, like the mayor of Holyoke, and also some of our state legislators. And they've made it very clear that they are desperate for information, and they listen to people that come in the door who know how to kind of speak the language of what matters at the local level, regardless of what the issue is that you're interested in. So, you know, that there's pluses and minuses to that. On the, you know, the negative side of interpreting those kinds of remarks, at least in my perspective, is that we don't have a lot of control over who goes through the door to try and meet with our local and state legislators. On the positive side, if you're willing to be that person to put yourself out there, you really have the potential to have quite an impact on how somebody thinks and potentially even votes on the issues that you care about. So it is I want to reiterate Sarah's point that it's not all about what's happening at the federal level. And in some ways, I think it can be really easy to jump in at the state and local level in particular and really have a quite immediate impact on what's happening. So we've got a couple more questions and just a few minutes left. So we have another, if you have any advice, this is kind of more at the institutional change level for doing social advocacy at the university level, especially related to mental health awareness.
Ooh, that's a good topic. I would say I've been learning a lot from academic Twitter these days. I've been following a lot of the hashtag Black in the Ivory, and I haven't worked a whole lot in higher ed, but I think that as much as I kind of have a love-hate relationship with Twitter, I think there's a lot of wisdom from the crowd of people in higher ed who are working to affect change on a whole slew of social justice issues. And it might be worth checking out the academic Twitter sphere to kind of see what people have been doing in different contexts and to learn from them what has been working and what has not been working.
Great, thank you. A very concrete question, does SPICY sponsor a policy group which is focused on race, the psychology of race, or race and discrimination in the US?
We have a policy committee which advises our leadership on all of our different activities. We have a number of grants that are specifically focused on the study of race, racism. SPICY broadly, all of our members study kind of the isms, racism, sexism, classism, ableism. That's kind of our cup of tea. So I'm not aware of a specific group that we have that works on race and racism, but each area of our programming, whether it's the conference, our grants programs, our fellowship programs, everything's kind of steeped in these issue areas across all of our different areas of programming. Great.
And we've got one final question, which I think will wrap things up nicely. So you mentioned in the presentation that sometimes the goals that researchers or psychologists hold are not necessarily the same goals that the policy stakeholders, policymakers themselves might hold, or at least it seems like they might not be aligned. So when that might be the case, do you have advice on effective ways to try and either align the goals of people who want to jump into the policy world and the policymakers themselves, or alternatively ways to kind of translate the research in a way that makes it more either acceptable or easier for policymakers to uptake? And part of this question is also, how can we make policymakers feel or actually be more incentivized to incorporate what it is that we're finding as researchers in our work?
I think that's a great question. And I think what I've learned through my years of meeting with policymakers is you have to find out what they care about. So if your policymaker isn't necessarily progressive or even interested in climate issues, but maybe they have a really prominent national zoo in their state that they do a lot of work with, and they really care about conservation for pandas, or find out what makes them passionate. There might be another lawmaker who's not really doing a whole lot on climate, but maybe she has a stakeholder group that she's really invested in, and they are a Native American population that lives on lands that are being increasingly flooded. So, find out what that policymaker cares about, find out what populations they're interested in, what stakeholders they've been working with already, and find an inroads through an established channel. Because inevitably there's going to be something that they're interested in that overlaps with something that you're interested in. You just have to find kind of something to hook your argument onto.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Sarah, for joining us today, and thank you to all of our attendees for coming. And I hope that we will see many of you next month. So this is a monthly webinar series and always meets on the second Tuesday of the month. Next month, we'll be with Julia Rohrer, and she'll be talking about causal inference in environmental psychology. So we'll be shifting to a different topic. I also just want to put a quick plug that Division 34 will be doing both pre-recorded and also about 4 hours of live programming during the APA virtual convention, which is on August 6th and 7th. And so you all should see some more information about the programming that we have planned within the next few days. So thanks again, everybody, for coming today. And thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Bye, all.